Imagine you have agreed to participate in an experiment. This session will last about an hour and will consist of several different unrelated tasks. For one part of the experimental session, you will be seated in a large networked computer lab. You and your fellow participants are going to play a game called Cyberball. It's a test of mental visualization. It will basically just be a virtual game of catch, played by passing an imaginary ball among 3 players using a computer interface. One player has the ball and decides which of the other 2 players to pass it to. Then that player has the ball and gets to decide who they're going to pass it to, and so on. You're told you'll be playing this game for several minutes. You are randomly and anonymously paired with 2 other players in the lab. Then the game starts. You have the ball first, so you get to decide which of the other 2 unknown players you want to pass it to, player 2 or player 3. So you pick one of these players, let's say player 3, and you pass the ball. Player 3 now has it and passes it over to 2. Now player 2 has it, tosses it back to player 3. Then player 3 passes it back to 2, and then 2 to 3, and then back to 2, and then back. It has now been several minutes, and these 2 anonymous jerks have turned this from a friendly 3-person game of catch into a 2-person game of keep away, with you in the role of the younger sibling. And there's nothing you can do about it. The game doesn't allow you to try to jump in and steal it. You can't prompt them with the friendly, "Hey guys, I'm open." All you can do is sit there, dejected and lonely, while your elementary school recess nightmare plays out in front of you. And as it turns out, that dejection and loneliness is exactly the point. Cyberball is well known among psychologists who have used it extensively in research studies to induce feelings of social rejection. Because you see, all those Cyberball players in that computer lab, they weren't really playing with other people. They instead were all playing against a computer program. In one version of the game, the version that made people feel socially connected, participants played against a computer that was programmed to pass them the ball frequently. But in the version of the game that was designed to make people feel socially isolated, the computer was programmed to ignore them, essentially keeping that person out of the game. And Cyberball has become really popular among psychologists precisely because it works really well at activating those feelings of social rejection. I know, psychologists can be jerks. One particular game of Cyberball was run using a group of participants in Hong Kong. Some participants left the game feeling pretty good about themselves. The rest ended up feeling socially rejected, since they hardly ever got the ball in that game. Then, participants moved on to the next of several more tasks. One of these tasks was a simple choice between 2 gambles. No wrong answers here. The researchers were just interested in which option seemed more appealing. Gamble A was a lottery with an 80% chance of winning $200 and a 20% chance of winning nothing. Gamble B was a lottery with a 20% chance of winning $800 and an 80% chance of winning nothing. Now, there's not a right choice here. Both gambles have the same expected payoff, so economically, they're equally valuable. The only difference is that gamble B is riskier. It has a higher reward, but it also comes with a higher probability of walking away with nothing. Later, when all the data was analyzed, it turned out that people were about 1.5 times more likely to prefer the riskier gamble if they'd previously played the socially isolating version of Cyberball than if they had played the version where they were included in the game. Feeling socially isolated and lonely caused people to become more risk-seeking in financial decision-making. In another study from the same paper, these researchers surveyed nearly 600 adults at a shopping mall, asking them, among other things, about the riskiness of their financial decision-making. In particular, they were asked what proportion of their disposable income they invested in low-risk vehicles like saving accounts versus higher-risk vehicles like stocks. They were also asked about how often they bet on horses and how often they gambled in casinos. And then finally, they were asked how often did they feel socially isolated and lonely. And the researchers found that people who indicated they often felt socially excluded were significantly more likely to invest in riskier financial products, and that they also gambled more frequently. Why? Well, in some additional studies, these researchers found out that feeling lonely focused people on the instrumentality of money. That is, on all the things money could do for them as compensation for their loneliness. And that led to an increased emphasis on money, led people to think about higher risk, higher reward financial decisions, the better to access greater amounts of money. If you'll permit a crude oversimplification, feeling lonely led people to make decisions as if they believed that money could buy them happiness, or could at least make up for social exclusion. And that changed their risk preferences and the financial decisions that they made. Today, we're going to talk about the role of emotion in decision-making. How our feelings can influence our decisions, even feelings like loneliness that are seemingly unrelated to the decisions at hand, like investing or gambling. We're discussing the role of emotion within the machinery section of the course. Recall that I've divided the topics related to decision-making into 3 groups, based on where they fit in the process of manufacturing a decision. There are informational inputs, which constitute the raw materials that we'll use to construct our decisions. There's the control panel, the motivational knobs and levers that we use to control the decision construction process. We'll talk about both of those groups in subsequent lectures. Emotion fits in the category of theories I'm calling the cognitive machinery, those characteristics of our shared cognitive capacities and processes that can transform information under the guidance of motivation into a decision. So far, we've taken a bounded rationality approach to understanding machinery. We've talked about the limits our cognitive machinery is under, and how these limitations lead to predictable biases in judgments. But we've still taken a mostly rational, logical approach to understanding decision-making, what psychologists would call a cold cognition approach. And in taking that tack, I've followed the prejudice of decision researchers and philosophers going back hundreds of years. It's not that these theorists didn't understand that emotion plays a role in decision-making. Clearly they did. But because decision research is often undertaken from the perspective of trying to improve or optimize decisions, or of trying to understand rational or boundedly rational choices, emotions were largely seen as a distraction, something that would make real decision-making worse, and would mostly do so in uninteresting or uninformative ways. In essence, hot cognition, or emotion, was set up in opposition to the quasi-rational, cold cognitive processes that were supposed to be driving decision-making. And this perspective, that emotion's role in decision-making is mostly just as a distraction that impairs decision-making, has a long, proud pedigree. Plato used an allegory of a charioteer, driving a chariot pulled by 2 winged horses. One represented rationality and moral impulses. The other, passions, appetites, and emotional impulses. Each of us, as a human soul, plays the role of the charioteer, struggling to get these horses, which often want to go in opposite directions, headed together towards enlightenment. Unless we think maybe Plato thought that both of these horses were necessary, or that both contributed something useful to the enterprise of being human, he argued that driving the chariot is difficult because only one of the horses, the one that represents rationality, is a good, worthy horse, noble, in his words. In his view, it was the emotional horse that caused all the problems. This was the antithesis in breed and character from the noble horse. Plato's view that emotion was naturally in opposition to reason, and thus did not aid in decision-making, was the dominant view in all of Western philosophy for the next several hundred years. In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin circled back around to Plato's allegory when talking about the role of emotion and reason in decision-making. He advised, If passion drives you, let reason hold the reins. There were some dissenting voices. The Scottish philosopher David Hume argued that, contra the prevailing view, reason was actually the servant of the passions and not the other way around. But it's only relatively recently that decision researchers have started coming around to the view that emotions might be more than just mere distractions in the decision-making process, but instead are integral and necessary part of the cognitive machinery of decision-making. Opening up the study of decision phenomena to the influence of emotions has led to a whole host of truly fascinating findings. In June 2003, an article in the Journal of Finance investigated the relationship between weather and stock market returns. The authors collected daily market performance data from the main stock exchanges in 26 countries over a period of 15 years. They found that there was a significant correlation between sunny mornings in the cities where the exchanges were located and positive daily returns. The explanation offered for these findings is that sunny days make traders happy, and happiness leads to optimism, and optimistic traders push up stock prices. As the authors coyly sum up, these findings are difficult to reconcile with fully rational price setting. It's always fun to find evidence of less than rational behavior in the hard-nosed world of financial trading markets. But it seems that even Gordon Gekko can't help but be cheered up by a sunny day. Other research suggests he may also be bummed out when his team loses. Another group of researchers, this time publishing in the journal Applied Economic Letters, studied the association between the performance of the English national soccer team and the financial performance of England's stock market, as measured by the FTSE 100 index. They uncovered two interesting relationships. First, the performance of the National Football Club was associated with predictable changes in the market. There was a very mildly positive effect when the team won, but a much larger negative effect when they lost. On average, returns were down about 0.13% after a loss. The second finding was that this relationship between the national team's losses and stock market performance just got stronger the further the team got into tournament play. So, if the English team lost in an international match, that was bad. If they lost during a tournament qualifying round, that was worse. But on the few occasions where the English team made it all the way to a finals game in a tournament and then lost, that was terrible. The losses the next day averaged 0.4%, more than 3 times the effect of losing a non-tournament game. As anyone who roots for a losing team can tell you, losing hurts. It's depressing. It puts you in a bad mood that can sometimes take days to shake off. Believe me, as a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan, I feel like I am uniquely qualified to talk about this phenomenon. And that bad mood that comes from watching your team lose an important game has sufficiently powerful and lingering effects that it can, apparently, influence trading behavior the next day, depressing prices enough to be picked up by a statistical model. One of the champions of including emotions in our understanding of human decision-making is the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio. Through his scholarly work and his popular writings, Damasio has persuasively built a case that although emotions can clearly bias decisions, that does not mean the absence of emotions would lead to better decision-making. In fact, the absence of emotions can, in some cases, simply leave a person unable to decide at all. And I don't mean that in some kind of hyperbolic sense, where the absence of emotions just makes choosing really difficult or makes deciding harder than it otherwise would be. No, I mean that not feeling emotions can make choosing impossible. Damasio and his colleagues worked with a lot of people who had very specific, very localized kind of brain damage. Sometimes the brain damage came naturally from a disease or accident, but most often the localized brain damage like this is caused by surgery to remove tumors to fix some other problem. Damasio and his team were interested in people whose brains had been damaged in just those areas that process emotions. What they found was that patients with this kind of localized damage, this inability to process emotions, were, cognitively speaking, high functioning. Many had very high IQs, but they were simply unable to make decisions. Damasio tells of asking patients simple questions like, when should they schedule their next appointment? Or which restaurant should they go to for dinner? And for simple decisions like these, the emotion-impaired respondents will start listing advantages and disadvantages associated with each option. They'll generate pros and cons, and then they just won't stop. They'll keep deliberating, listing the advantages of Tuesday relative to Wednesday for a follow-up appointment, and then Wednesday relative to Tuesday, and then they'll just keep going. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It appears that without emotional cues, what Damasio calls somatic markers, people are, in many instances, incapable of moving beyond deliberation to actually committing to a course of action. Based on the work of Damasio and others, it now appears that the rational and emotional systems are not constantly at odds. Increasingly, the view is that emotion is absolutely necessary in decision-making, that our decision-making machinery simply would not run properly without it. So, if we accept the proposition that emotions are not a sideshow, but are actually integral to decision-making, how should we try to capture and understand that influence? How should we incorporate emotions into our models of decision-making? Well, as you might expect, psychology being psychology, there are actually several prominent theories of emotion in decision-making. But I'd like to focus on just one of the more popular approaches. This theory is called the appraisal tendency framework, and it was developed by Jennifer Lerner from Carnegie Mellon and Dacher Keltner from the University of California. Appraisal tendency is built primarily around the argument that understanding the role of emotion in decision-making requires understanding the influence of specific emotional states, since distinct emotions can lead to very different outcomes. Now, this may not sound like a particularly groundbreaking starting point, but in reality it was. Previous to the appraisal tendency framework, most research on mood or emotion and decision-making tended to focus just on the valence of the emotion. So basically, researchers mostly just looked at whether decision-making under positive emotions differed from decision-making under negative emotions. And while there are certainly insights to be had by looking at differences based on emotional valence, Lerner and Keltner argued that emotions are more complex and more nuanced than just positive and negative. So looking just at that dimension is going to leave a lot unexplained. They proposed, based on some earlier research, that emotions can be described by a matrix of 6 attributes or dimensions that describe what each particular emotion does, how that emotion affects a person. These dimensions are certainty, pleasantness, attentional activity, anticipated effort, personal control, and responsibility. Pleasantness is pretty straightforward. That's just whether the emotional state is pleasant or aversive, something you enjoy feeling or something you'd rather avoid. The other dimensions might not be as intuitive. Let me walk you through the rest. Attentional activity is whether the emotion causes people to become more alert and attentive versus being more relaxed and sedate. Certainty describes the degree to which the future feels predictable and understandable. Control refers to how much one feels that individual agency can alter the current situation. Anticipated effort is an assessment of how much physical or mental exertion might be needed in the near future. And responsibility describes the extent to which one feels that blame or credit for a situation can be pinned on someone or something specific. To illustrate how this framework might be useful, consider anger and fear. Both of these are negative emotions, so they have the same valence. But they differ on many of the other 6 appraisal tendencies. For example, anger tends to be associated with a high degree of certainty, elevated levels of perceived individual control, and an assumption that specific others bear responsibility for problems. In contrast, fear is associated with a low degree of certainty, reduced perceived control. This leads to very different predictions about how these 2 negative emotions will affect decision-making. We should expect someone who is angry to be more likely to choose action than someone who is sad, for example, because sadness is associated with less certainty and less individual control. Sadness, therefore, tends to lead to passive decisions and inaction. Ironically, there are emotions of opposite valence that are still similar on many other appraisal dimensions. Happiness, for example, tends to be high on the certainty and individual control dimensions. This makes happiness similar to anger in some important ways. The appraisal tendency framework makes the rather surprising prediction that there are situations in which we might expect an angry person and a happy person to make similar choices, choices that favor action and exhibit confidence, for example. Okay, that was fairly general. Let's get specific. One of the predictions derived from the appraisal tendency framework is that some emotions are associated with feeling certain, confident in one's own judgments and assessments, and other emotions are not. For example, disgust and happiness are both characterized by high levels of certainty, even though one is a negative emotion and one is a positive emotion. Fear and hope, on the other hand, are both associated with low levels of certainty. Some psychologists from Stanford used an autobiographical emotion recall task to induce different emotional states in a group of participants. People were asked to remember and vividly recall a time when they felt disgust, happiness, fear, or hope, and to write a short essay about that experience. After they were re-feeling one of these emotional states, the participants were asked to participate in an ostensibly unrelated task, making predictions about the future. They were then presented with a series of predictions and asked whether each would happen in the next 2 years. So, for example, one of the predictions was whether the Major League Baseball home run record would be beaten in the next 2 years. Participants indicated their predictions and then indicated how confident they were in those predictions. And, consistent with the appraisal tendency framework, the participants who had previously felt disgust and happiness, the 2 high confidence emotions, indicated they were significantly more confident in their predictions than were participants who felt fear or hope, the 2 low confidence emotions. The valence of the emotion had no effect on the confidence ratings. Another set of researchers, led by Lisa Kavanaugh of the University of Southern California, built upon this idea that individual emotions are characterized by specific attributes. They investigated differences among several positive emotions with regards to pro-social decision-making. They found that positive emotions of all kinds tend to increase pro-social behavior towards close others, donations to local charities, for example, or a desire to shop local. However, this boost from positive emotions did not extend to pro-social choices that would benefit distant others, international charities, for example. The one exception was love. When feeling love as a generalized emotion, people were generous to everyone, both those close by and those farther afield. The researchers argued that love as an emotion has a property of seeking to broaden connections with others, and that this particular characteristic is lacking from the other positively valenced emotions. Consistent with this idea, these researchers induced various emotional states in participants by having them read some ad mock-ups designed to inspire feelings of love, pride, hope, or compassion. Later, in the experimental session, participants were given the opportunity to indicate how much money they would choose to donate to two hypothetical charities if they had an extra $10 with which to donate. One of the charities was local. It was called the Environmental Defense Local Fund. The other was not. It was called Natural Resource Federation International Fund. As expected, all of the positive emotion conditions ended up donating more to charity than did a comparison condition in which mood was held neutral. But, more germane to the study at hand, only those who felt love, not hope or pride or even compassion, ended up donating more to the international charity. Only the positive emotion associated with the specific appraisal tendency of forming new social connections led to increased pro-social behavior toward distant groups. One more example. Researchers from NYU and Columbia University examined differences between anxiety and sadness on decision-making, in particular on the risk preferences that drive particular types of decision-making. Consistent with the appraisal tendency framework, these researchers hypothesized that these negative emotions would lead to different types of decisions because they're associated with different levels of perceived control. Participants in this study were induced to feel either anxiety or sadness by having them read a one-page vignette under the guise of conducting an empathy test. Participants were encouraged to feel the protagonist's emotions as vividly as possible and to try to imagine how they would feel if they had the experience that they were reading about. In the anxiety condition, the vignette involved a protagonist who receives a call from the doctor and is asked to come immediately to discuss an urgent matter. The scenario suggests that the person might have cancer, but it isn't clear. And the scene ends before the person reaches the doctor's office. So there's no resolution to the uncertainty, just an ominous foreboding. The sadness condition dealt with someone whose mother has fallen suddenly and inexplicably ill. The person rushes home to be with her, but ultimately the mother dies. Yeah, this is probably not the most fun experiment to participate in. Regardless, after the empathy exercise, participants moved on to a separate survey. This one was on job preferences. They were asked to imagine they had received two attractive job offers, and they had to choose between them. The jobs varied in terms of risk and reward. One job was described as having a high salary with low job security, whereas the other was described as an average salary with high job security. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, people who had previously been made to feel anxious tended to prefer the secure job, the one with a higher salary. Only 32% of those in the anxious condition chose the high-risk, high-reward job. That compares to 56% who chose the riskier job in the neutral mood condition. What was more interesting to me when I read the study was that the preference for risk dramatically increased in the sadness condition. Among the group who had been induced to feel sad, 78% chose the riskier job with the higher salary. Those two negative emotions led to exactly the opposite risk preferences, with anxiety driving people towards safer choices and sadness turning people into risk seekers. So, to sum up, with apologies to Plato, the latest evidence suggests that emotions are not the enemy of cold, calculating, rational decision-making. In fact, it appears that emotions are absolutely vital to decision-making. Emotions are an indispensable component of the cognitive machinery that allows us to make decisions. And the way our emotional systems interact with the rest of our decision-making apparatus is wonderfully complex and nuanced. It is not the case that we may simply consider whether someone is in a good mood or a bad mood and anticipate their decision response from that. In point of fact, decision researchers have identified many important dimensions on which specific emotions differ. Even seemingly similar emotions like love and compassion, or anxiety and sadness, can differ in a number of important dimensions. And those specific attributes can lead to different cognitive gears and cogs being engaged, ultimately leading to different decision outcomes.